In the early 1930s, the United States was in the midst of the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in 1929, throwing the country into financial ruin. The tenant farmers in the South were not particularly affected by the market crash. They were already facing deep financial troubles. The price of cotton, a major crop in the South, was at an historic low. Much of the South had been hit by a devastating flood in 1927, followed by 2 years of relentless drought.
In 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took office, his greatest challenge was what to do with the American South. The South was the country's poorest region at the time. It was home to nearly 1.8 million tenant farmers or sharecroppers who didn't own their own land. And to make matters worse, these farmers were hit in 1927 with one of the worst floods in American history, followed by years of drought in 1931 and 32. Cotton prices went from a high of about 17 cents a pound in 1929 to barely 5 cents a pound in 1932. So part of Roosevelt's strategy was to get these displaced farmers who had either lost their land or didn't own any of their land back on some land that they could own and be productive again, and this was part of his experiment in Dyess.
The idea was that they were going to have a big chunk of land and divide it all up into farm units, and eventually the farm families were going to buy them or pay for them. And at the same time, they built, a community center, a movie theater, had a store or other stores, and it was going to become a community.
When the Depression hit, there were all sorts of economic woes across the country. I'm not sure if anybody was more hard hit than the farmers. So when Franklin Roosevelt became president, a number of policies were introduced across all sorts of sectors of the country, but as part of the New Deal, there were any number of initiatives directed toward trying to do something to address the plight of farmers.
In the early Depression, there were a lot of people who suddenly became interested in what was called back to the land. People had moved from the farm to the cities, and this had not worked out for them in many cases. The Depression came along. They were out of work. They were losing their homes, their businesses, and so forth. And so there were some people in a kind of to tell you the truth, a dreamy fashion who believed that maybe people could go back to the land and get started, growing their own food and the like.
The Dyess Colony was one of those New Deal initiatives as an effort to address the plight of farmers.
The Dyess Colony was also part of the Resettlement Administration and then the Farm Security Administration. All of these agencies had programs for rural relief, or they may have called it at the time rural rehabilitation.
It was an idea that came about from W.R. Dyess, who was the Arkansas administrator for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And he came up with the idea of acquiring land in Mississippi County, which did happen to be his home county. He acquired, under his idea, the federal government acquired 16,000 acres of land and then divided this land into colonist farmsteads, 20 and 40 acre farmsteads, for 500 colonist families.
In the spring of 1934, about 400 men were taken off the Mississippi County relief rolls and put to work at the colony. By September, that number had swelled to nearly 1,500. These were both white and black workers, although the colony was to be a white-only town. They first built barracks, dining halls, and bathing facilities separate for blacks and whites. Roads and bridges were built, and ditches to drain the main part of town were dug. 38 houses were built in town to house support personnel, including the doctor and nurses for a brand new hospital. A community building as well as the administration building was constructed. They then began to build the farmers' houses on designated 20 and 40-acre plots. A complete, brand new town was being carved out of Mississippi County buckshot gumbo swampland.
Well, construction began on the first 500 homes in July 1934, and they came in 3 rooms, 4 rooms, or 5 rooms, and they were designed by a Little Rock architect named Howard Eichenbaum. And as you can see, each one had a front porch and a back porch to give them add a little bit more to the design and to give them a little bit more space. The middle room was the living room. Then you had your kitchen off to the left and the bedrooms off to the right. And they don't look like much today, but you got to remember these were farm families, many of whom this was their very first home they ever owned. So they were very economical designs for their time, very functional.
Many of the farmers relocated to the colony had young families, and over 1,000 of the colonists were children. 4 schools were built around the colony to provide an education for them. 3 grade schools and 1, where the school building sits today, was a 1st through 12th grade school. With a new theater in the heart of town, any child with a quarter could enjoy a Saturday matinee with a cereal, a feature film, and a bag of freshly popped popcorn. However, quarters were still hard to come by. William Dyess's dream of a brand new farm community in northeast Arkansas was coming true, but he never got to see it completed. On January 14, 1936, the worst aviation accident to that date occurred in northeast Arkansas. All 17 people aboard the plane were killed.
Dyess was killed in a plane crash. After taking off from Memphis, the plane developed some kind of trouble. What happened is not known, and it crashed near Brinkley, and everybody on board was killed.
1 month after the death of Dyess, Colonization Project No. 1 was incorporated as the Dyess Colony. After Dyess's death, work continued on the colony under the direction of Floyd Sharp, who was appointed to be his successor. By late spring 1936, 490 farmhouses were built, and 484 families from every county in the state had been relocated to the colony. Everett Henson was the second child of Herschel and Nancy Henson. He and his parents, along with his older sister and 2 younger brothers, moved to the colony in the spring of 1936.
And the house had tongue-groove lumber in it, and you couldn't feed the chickens through the sitting in the kitchen, and you couldn't feed the chickens that was under the floor. It was open, but it didn't have no cracks in it because it was tongue-groove lumber. And we thought of it as a beautiful place. Some people probably didn't, because they lived on a place that didn't have a tree left on it probably, or except a shade tree. But my dad had built 2 houses before, right out in the woods. And one of them didn't have much of a road to it. You had to go down a ditch bank to get to it even. So this didn't bother us none at all. But it was, everything was brand new. There wasn't nothing old there at all. There wasn't an old store, or old service station, or anything that's closed up. Everything was brand new.
When given the opportunity to become one of the colonists, Ray Cash and his family jumped at it. And Johnny Cash himself has talked in his biographies about what that ride was like to the promised land, he called it. And he talks about how when they got to their house, they walked in and there were 5 cans of paint sitting on the floor of the kitchen, the empty cans of paint where they had just finished, painting the house. And so everything was brand new and spick and span. And he said his mother sat down on the floor and cried because it was the first new house she'd ever been in.
Daddy would take the H. John Deere tractor over here to Cash's house and disc their land up for him. In return, Cash would bring his whole family, Ray Cash would bring his whole family over here on the Road 1 out here, Gene Williams Road now, and chop cotton for us to pay us back for Daddy disking their land up.
Though the house was new and the paint barely dry, life was anything but easy for a young Johnny Cash growing up on the colony.
Most of the stories had to do with hard work, how hard the work was. Being in the fields, carrying cotton in a sack, getting up early, getting out there and working. Um, like I said, he didn't mythologize, this kind of uh, fairy tale existence as a farmer. It was really hard work. He said he never wanted to go back to that. But he did have a great, great fondness and spiritual connection to this part of the world. Because this is not only where he came from, but where all the music he loved came from. And he was deeply connected to that, and his own art grew out of what he heard when he lived here.
The lives of a farmer and his family in the 1930s was difficult. The colonists were no exception. Although the farmhouses were new, they had no running water and no electricity until the mid-40s.
We had to, didn't have no water at the place, didn't have a pump drove. So we went to the ditch in front of the house and got water and boiled it for drinking water and whatever we had to use it for.
My grandmother washed her clothes in the wash tub, and they all worked, None of them had an easy life. It was a much harder life than I could ever imagine living, the life my dad lived here.
As the Dyess farmers struggled to clear their land and make a living of sorts, there were those that looked at the colony and farm projects like it as nothing less than a handout.
Well, there's a big misconception that the Dyess colony was an experiment in socialism, but really the exact opposite is true. This was a new start for most of these people. They were poor, landless tenant farmers who were given a second lease on life. And of course, there was a very tough screening process. These people had to work.
You had to meet a really strong set of criteria. You had to have been a farmer previously and now on the welfare rolls, and had to demonstrate that you were of good character and that you had been a great farmer prior to the economic setbacks of the Depression.
They had decided that they would get 2 or 3 people from out of each county to come to Dyess. And they was hooked up to start with, where the county agent is the one that you had to be on some kind of welfare, some kind of government program to get to Dyess. And he knew the people. He knew if you was a sot, if you drank all the time, didn't raise a crop, and didn't work, and he knew what kind of person you was. So he was the one that chose what people that would make good attendance to go to Dyess. And then they had inspectors that went out and interviewed these people, and they asked them all kinds of personal questions about, does a woman raise a good garden, does she keep a good house, and all kinds of personal questions. He even went to the schools and asked the kids, was they rowdy kids, if they got in trouble all the time or what, because they needed people to go to Dyess that was people that was going to stay, that wanted to go, not just somewhere for another year and then move off like the sharecropper does.
They came in here, they cleared this land, they dug the ditches, they built the roads. That was hard work. And then, of course, the next step was the hard work of planting their crops. So they earned this. What they had to do is, of course, once their first crop came in, they had to pay the government back. So this wasn't a handout. They actually had to make payments. Everything that they got from the store, all of their supplies, it all went on an account, and they had to pay the government back.
The ones that was chosen had to have a doctor to examine them, the ones in their hometown. And then when they come picked them up and took them to Dyess, they had to go into the hospital and let them examine them. Their own Dyess had their own hospital, and they examined them there. And if they had heart trouble, a rupture, or high blood pressure, anything that would keep the man and the wife from clearing the land, they were turned down.
You came, they gave you a 20-acre farmstead with a house already on it, but you had to clear the land and convert it to agricultural production, and then you had to take responsibility for paying back to the government the cost of that land, so that eventually you wound up owning your own farmsteads.
This was really, it's kind of like getting a home building loan today, where you get the money to buy the land and build your home, then you got to pay it back. So it really isn't I wouldn't call it socialism. I would call it more of a building loan type situation.
One good thing about Dyess Colony is that it was, for some families, a stopgap measure and gave them a chance to work and acquire some skills, possibly, until the war came along, and then everybody went to work.
The colonists did have one treat that most Americans did not have in 1936, a visit by the First Lady.
Well, this is a spot where Eleanor Roosevelt paid a visit to the residents of Dyess on June 9th, 1936. She had been given a 20-minute tour of the colony and then came back here to the administration building where she had dinner with the residents. And afterwards she gave a speech up on the porch of the administration building. To wish the residents well, and said that all of Washington was watching and how proud she was of them. She had recently visited similar colonies in Iowa and Arthurdale, West Virginia. And there's a funny story that was reported in the press that during her speech she was interrupted by the barking of a little brown dog, and of course Eleanor had a famous Scotty Terrier named Falla, which of course the entire country knew. And she said, "Oh, I don't mind at all, I like dogs." And then afterwards she stayed to shake hands with all the residents. She was very interested in these types of experiments from the very start.
By the end of 1936, the Dyess Colony had been incorporated, had been visited by the First Lady of the United States, and boasted a population of nearly 2,500. That peak in population would not last long. As the end of January 1937 drew near, much of the central United States had seen record rainfall for that month. Parts of Arkansas had received over 12.5 inches of rain, over 8 inches more than usual. Flooding began in the north and moved to the south. The vast amounts of rainwater proved to be too much for the banks of the Tyronza River, which flowed through the Dyess Colony. With the flood well underway, National Relief Director Harry Hopkins and an entourage of high-ranking government officials toured parts of the rain-ravaged areas.
With General Edward Markham, Chief of Army Engineers, Surgeon General Thomas Parran, Jr., Colonel F.C. Harrington, Chief WPA Engineer, and James L. Feeser in charge of Red Cross operations, Administrator Hopkins visited the entire flood area from Memphis to Cincinnati, reporting on the amazing morale and splendid cooperation of the great variety of flood relief agencies and facilities. The committee were almost caught in Arkansas by the rising waters of the St. Francis. They left over roads already underwater, the last traffic over this road for several days.
Because most of the residents did not own cars and had no way to leave, the government evacuated the Dyess Colony.
Some of us rode a truck out of there and some rode a train out of there during the flood, but they had 1,500 people living in the community building, which was a huge meeting building with a stage on it and a couple of rooms, one on each side of it, for meetings in the library. And there was as much as 1,500 people living there, and the water was cut off because they didn't have no power. They had to bring water in from Osceola somewhere to drink, and the toilets wouldn't work because they didn't have no water on the towers to pump them because electricity was off. And but they moved them out of there, some of them by train and some of them by bus.
The Dyess Colony refugees were taken to Memphis, where they spent the night in the train station before being transported to Camp Polk, now Camp Robinson, near North Little Rock.
We lived in a tent that was floored, and then the tent was stretched around the base of that. Had a little old stove in the middle of it, and I believe it was a coal stove. And they fed us in the mess halls.
I do think that the flood of 1937 did have an impact on the Dyess Colony. There were some people who came there with the first wave of colonists in 1934 and 1935 who may have been a bit unhappy, who may not have found it to be exactly what they wanted it to be. And certainly the flood of 1937, which wiped out a lot of the efforts to date, really was the icing on the cake that caused a lot of people to just throw up their hands and leave. Others, though, took the 1937 flood in stride, and it was just one more hardship to be overcome, and they, came back even stronger.
We had 20 acres to start with. And then when the people started moving out after the 37 flood, and they started getting some jobs and going back home, a lot of the place was empty then, and our place was empty too in 38. And we got that place. And we could have kept the house and barn and all of it if we had money to pay $100 a room for the house. But we didn't have the money for that. And later on, they tore the houses down, and some of them was moved off.
The flood of 1937 dealt a blow to the population of the colony, but the town itself was thriving. And as quickly as the farmers moved out, the resettlement administration was moving more families in. By the end of 1938, 649 families had lived at one time on the colony. 252 families, 39%, had gone back home. By 1942, when the United States was fully involved in World War II, many of the young men on the colony joined the services, and other residents moved off to get jobs to support the war effort. By 1946, the government gave up control of the colony, and Dyess was just another small Arkansas farm community. In the decades to follow, Dyess saw slow, steady population losses, typical of most small Arkansas farm communities. In the late 1940s and early 50s, some farmers like Ray Cash and Herschel Henson sold their farms and moved into town to take jobs in the nearby oleo factory. The era of the small farmer was coming to an end.
The interesting thing to me is that the people that are still around that live there, when you hear them talk about it, they talk about it with such love and such fond memories. And, you know, a lot of little towns are like that, you know, they're described as kind of these Norman Rockwell little places, but I've just never really heard a small town described the way these people remember it. It really must have been truly a special place.
Today, Dyess is home to just over 400 residents. However, the sleepy Mississippi County community may well have a brighter future in store. With the help of resident Gene Williams and Arkansas State University, the administration building will see new life.
Well, right now, ASU's project is we are restoring the town center, the administration building, and the former theater in the center. We have a grant to do the exterior restoration of the administration building, and we have applied for another grant to do the interior. Once the interior is finished, the plan is that the city of Dyess will move their municipal offices into one side of the administration building, and then on the other side we will have museum exhibits that focus on the Dyess colony, what it was all about, as well as exhibits on some of the colonist families like the Johnny Cash family, and talk about how growing up in Dyess impacted Johnny Cash and his music. Some exhibits related to Gene Williams, who also grew up there in Dyess. And in fact, Gene Williams is the one who is responsible for donating the money to originally acquire the administration building.
In April 2011, it was announced that Arkansas State University had purchased the boyhood home of Johnny and Tommy Cash and has plans to restore it to its original 1934 condition.
I'm surprised and I'm thrilled, both. This is where I spent the first 16 years of my life. And it's just, it's an amazing thing that's going to take place here. And I think I speak for all my family in saying that we're very proud and thrilled to see what's happening here.
It's been over 75 years since the first farmers came to Dyess. And although William Dyess's dream of a self-sufficient colony where small farmers could raise crops and families only lasted a short time, Dyess is a community with a history unlike anywhere else. Soon it will be home to a museum as a reminder of life on the colony and a way of life that is hard to imagine today. And with the restoration of the administration building and the boyhood home of musical icon Johnny Cash, this little town's history will be remembered for generations to come.